As I was saying, Performing Copyright is your latest book. I enjoyed it quite a lot. I know why it's called Performing Copyright, but could you please tell the audience why it's called like that? Why is it Performing Copyright?
Thanks. It's a very good question. And I don't think anyone has asked that one yet, even though the book has been out for a while and I've done quite a few interviews about it. So the answer is that I wanted to hint at the fact that the way in which the law works is itself performative, that lawyers go through the practice of law. We write the scripts, and then in the courtroom, again, it's a performance, the way in which the case is argued. A lot of, especially in the UK, where there's this tradition of the barrister, barristers are trained to act like barristers, to speak in a rhetoric. And so there's very much a performative quality to the law itself.
Esto es, La Inquietud con Garret Edwards, el lugar donde hay más preguntas que certezas.
Damos vuelta de página aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario. Tenemos un enorme honor, placer y privilegio. Escuchen bien, es profesor de Derecho en la London School of Economics en Londres, en Inglaterra, en Reino Unido. Es especialista en Derecho de la Propiedad Intelectual y también en Derecho Constitucional. Antes de dar clase en LSE, también dio clases en City, University of London, y también en la Universidad de Cardiff, en Gales. Es doctor por Queen Mary, la Universidad de Londres, es máster por la London School of Economics. También se recibió en Derecho en la Universidad de Galway, en Irlanda. Tiene múltiples publicaciones, tanto en revistas académicas especializadas como libros que ha publicado, entre ellos el más reciente, Performing Copyright, Law, Theater and Authorship. Ya va apareciéndonos aquí en pantalla y se va acercando. Ha visitado y dado clases en Tokio, en Japón, en Shanghái, en China, también en Pisa, Italia, en la Escuela Superior de Santana. No es otro que el doctor Luke McDONAGH, and now I'm transitioning into English. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us, Luke. Garret Edwards here on the other side.
Muchas gracias, Garrett. I wish that I had enough Spanish to be able to do the whole interview, but unfortunately, even though it's been my privilege to visit universities in Spain and Mexico and Colombia and Cuba, I only have a kind of conversational level of ordering at a restaurant or introducing a talk, but not to actually speak about the law. So thank you for accommodating me in English today.
Thank you for joining us, Luke. As I was saying, Performing Copyright is your latest book. I enjoyed it quite a lot. I know why it's called Performing Copyright, but could you please tell the audience why it's called like that? Why is it Performing Copyright?
Thanks. It's a very good question. And I don't think anyone has asked that one yet, even though the book has been out for a while and I've done quite a few interviews about it. So the answer is that I wanted to hint at the fact that the way in which the law works is itself performative, that lawyers go through the practice of law. We write the scripts, and then in the courtroom, again, it's a performance, the way in which the case is argued. A lot of, especially in the UK, where there's this tradition of the barrister, barristers are trained to act like barristers, to speak in a rhetoric. And so there's very much a performative quality to the law itself. And within copyright law, then, the role of the author is an imagined role within our legal frame of reasoning. We have a person in mind who is doing that role. And so even if the author is not on stage, in the case of, let's say, a play that they have written, they are still in an odd way playing a role. That they are part of what is happening in the dramatic process. And one of the things that I try to do in my book is to shed light on the fact that in the context of theatre, the process of writing a play is often highly collaborative and it relies on performance. So you may start with a rough script, but apart from in a few cases, Samuel Beckett, Harold Pinter, Martin McDonough, they tend to expect the script that they've written maybe at home is performed exactly. But not many writers do that. Many writers want to go into a workshop scenario with the director, with the actors, and they test out the script. They see what works and what doesn't work. Some lines get readjusted. Some new characters might be written. The whole play will be reshaped. And the way that that happens is, as I mentioned, highly collaborative. And it brings up the question, which, you know, is at the center of the book: who is performing the role of the author? Is it simply the person who's doing the writing of the main part of the text? Or is it also the director who is suggesting character changes, could be coming up with the concept for a scene? Is it actors who are improvising lines? So the law has to have a way of dealing with this complex collaborative scenario and figuring out at the end of the day, once you get past performance, authorship, you get to the question of ownership. Who should have the rights? And that's where copyright law very much comes into play.
Look, is theater different from other forms of art when you view it from a legal focus?
It's another great question. I would argue yes. It is a unique field of creativity. The closest to it in other fields is probably music, because music is often a collaboration between different musicians. But there's also a link, of course, with literature, because you're talking about a lot of words most of the time with a play. Though under the law, a work of drama could also be a work of dance or a work of mime. So you don't actually have to have words. The law can protect a sequence of dance moves if they're original, if it's not just a copy of what's come before. But nonetheless, in my book, I wanted to concentrate on plays that are written to be performed, that have a lyrical content to them. And so you end up with something that is a script, and there may be minor variations on the script with each performance, but the point of playwriting is to come up with something that is repeatable, and that's kind of the final script where, you know, as I say, there may be minor variations, but you go to the theater expecting to see the play performed as it broadly is conceived. Though, as I say, there are certain plays that are quite improvisatory. So there's always complexity at the edges here. And there had never really been a book that had concentrated solely on the theatrical realm. A lot of deep dives into copyright and culture had focused on literature, occasionally on music, maybe on film. And one of the reasons why I chose theatre and why I think it's worth studying is that there's not that much case law. So in the UK, for example, really just one per decade is kind of what we get coming to the High Court. Whereas, you know, we've seen Ed Sheeran in court in the UK more recently.
Playing his guitar.
Playing his guitar, again, being very performative in the way he speaks to the judge, or in the US, the jury. So I wanted to figure out why that was, because obviously in any field of culture, there are disputes that happen between parties. People fall out with one another, they argue over money, they argue over property. And I was curious to know why there were so few cases. And I had a reasoned, kind of educated guess that it was to do with the fact that litigation is very expensive, and most theatre is subsidized and doesn't make a lot of money. So unlike TV or film or the music industries, most new plays, when they're written, even if they're a hit, they don't necessarily make all that much money. They might only have one performance run. So you might have a play that does reasonably well, but then for whatever reason doesn't capture the attention of a director 10 years down the line and get performed again and again. So a lot of theatre is kind of in the moment and subsidized and doesn't produce a lot of surplus revenue. And so if you're going to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds to argue a case in the High Court, you need to make sure it's worth your while. And so what I came, the educated guess that I had was that it's not that there are no disputes here, because disputes are in human nature, everywhere. But what is quite likely is that these disputes are happening behind the scenes. And the law may be framing these disputes in some way because participants have some idea of what the law is. And certainly the Writers' Union in Britain is very much pro-copyright and pro the playwright having 100% of the copyright in the play. We know that from the publications that the Writers' Guild of Great Britain puts out. But as I said, in the absence of case law, there was no way to judge this other than talking to the people in theatre, which is why I decided to do empirical research and conduct some interviews with playwrights and directors and actors to see what are what types of disputes happen, how many tend to happen on, are they the sorts of things that lead to parties walking away from projects and things not going ahead? Or actually, is the theatre scene able to resolve all of these difficulties without us lawyers getting involved? And if so, what does that say about the law? That this normative way of resolving disputes one way or the other, what can that tell us lawyers about our own subject? So I went in with the hope of learning a lot from the people that I interviewed. And I certainly was not disappointed in how much I learned from them.
Look, this is not the main focus of the book, but you dedicate some time to explaining a little bit of copyright history when it comes to the UK, which I think you did masterfully, and that for non-experts, it's a really tour de force in how you can understand the whole context before getting to today's theater and today's copyright law when it comes to the theatrics. And you also explain a little bit on how things work before copyright law as we know it. How did plagiarism work back then, even though it could be a little bit anachronistic speaking about plagiarism in those days?
Thanks, Garret. Again, really great question. It was important to me to look at, so for example, I start the book with Elizabethan England, the time of Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe and Ben Jonson. And I thought that would be an interesting time period to start because there wasn't a statutory copyright law, as you know, until 1710 in what is now the UK. Then it was primarily the law of England, but we did have a sense of law playing a role in the way that culture was regulated. But this didn't happen through the statutory system. It happened through, the old system of what we call in England the Crown, which was really, at the time of Shakespeare, Queen Elizabeth. So the Crown could grant privileges to print, and so privileges were granted to the Stationers' Company, which had the monopoly on printing in England, except for the universities in Oxford and Cambridge. And so, the question is, who were these stationers? It's kind of an odd word. What it essentially was a cartel of publishers who were in a kind of guild together, and they controlled the print trade in England. And so they had the privilege to print. Nobody else could legally print other than the universities. And that meant that if you were a writer, you had to, and you wanted your work to be in print, then you had to actually engage with these publishers. And obviously many writers did. They would sell their manuscript to a publisher and the publisher would print it. Now, because there was no author's right system, no statutory copyright, most of the time that was the end of the transaction. So when you had the manuscript in your hand, you had physical possession of the poem or the book or the play. You could sell it, you could get maybe £1 if you were lucky, maybe much less if you were a new writer. And then the stationers took control, and you probably wouldn't get anything further beyond that initial payment. You weren't entitled to a statutory royalty or anything like that. And the other element that was quite complicated is that if you were someone like Shakespeare, who was organizing plays at the Globe, other actors were performing them, they might get hold of a script because they'd need to learn from it. You know, after a play, one of the actors might sell the script to the stationers and they'd get the money. And there's nothing you could do about that because you didn't have a legal right to prevent the actor from doing that. And then, of course, we've got the performance arena where, you know, Shakespeare was a shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain's Men and later the King's Men. And they ran the Globe. They could charge, let's say, a penny or maybe a bit less to come in. And they would share in the revenues from the performance of the play. And at this point in legal history, there is no protected performance right at all. If you can get a hold of a script, you can perform it. So
you get people going into the plays and trying to scribble down the lines and everything like that.
Well, it's certainly a little bit later, because at this point in Elizabethan, not that many people could read or write. So not many people would have been able to do that at this point. But certainly as time went on, once you get into the 18th century, that begins to happen. As literacy goes up, people try to memorize plays and write them down, and we begin to get litigation. So there's a little bit of what we call copyright infringement, or some people refer to as plagiarism, essentially copying without permission. It happens a bit later. But just to go back for a second to the Elizabethan time. So I do mention in the book that what we now call plagiarism or copying without permission, you know, Shakespeare was a copyist, took whole plots from the Roman playwrights, and who had themselves taken plots from the Greek playwrights. You know, so this back and forth was a consistent theme in theatrical production, and so it's not that copying wasn't happening. It's just that that wasn't something that the law stopped you from doing at that point. The only thing the law would stop is that if, for example, one publisher published another stationer's printed work without permission, then the courts would intervene. So that kind of thing would you could stop. If you had the right to publish a play, you could stop somebody else from doing so. But again, that wasn't the authors. That was just the publishers who had their nice cozy cartel. And then from 1710, the authors begin to take on a larger role. And as you say, we get to this point where suddenly, as we get to the end of the 18th century, authors, playwrights, and also musicians, because they're also interested in performance, they begin to say, we need to have not just a right to control our plays in print or our works in print, but also in performance. And so they make the argument, first in France, that there should be a right to give permission to perform the work. So when the work is performed, you should be entitled to some revenue. But this doesn't happen in Britain until 1833, and then it's kind of finished off around 1842. So between 1833 and 1842, Britain finally brings in a right to performance. And then, but at this point, these are separate rights. The right to print and performance are completely separate statutes. They can be owned by different people. It's all a bit too complicated. So by 1911, the UK finally brings in a new Copyright Act that unifies all of the elements of performance and adaptation and print into one copyright, which is in fact a bundle of all of these rights. And therefore, finally, the author has control of all of the rights, and can then decide, who do I want to sell the print rights to? Who do I want to sell the performance rights to? Oh, look, a film studio wants to make an adaptation of my books or my play, and I'll sell it to them. So over time, authors get more and more powerful. But of course, we know that even today, unless you are Taylor Swift or Ed Sheeran or a very famous, you don't have that much power actually in these negotiations. But nonetheless, you have a lot more than you had 200, 300 years ago. So that's something that we can see in the legal history. We can see how that changes over time.
Look, we go back to the 21st century. In the latter part of the book, you use two philosophical concepts, two literary concepts, to play a little bit on how you analyze why some of the players decide to behave the way they do. So you use aura and trajectory. How do you use these concepts to play with copyright law and with theater in particular?
Yeah, thanks, Garret. So I use these concepts for a very particular reason. Within copyright law, the author, which in theater, it is usually the playwright that gets the rights to the work. So if you're recognized under the law as the author of the play, and you would usually be the playwright, one of the rights you have is to object if somebody else does something derogatory with your work, and that we call the integrity right. And so I think in one of your earlier episodes, you talked about street art, and there was a big case in the US where some street artists were commissioned to do a mural in New York. And then when the mural was destroyed by the property owner, those artists were able to sue the property owner under this right because their work had been destroyed without permission. Now, obviously in theater, there's no physical sculpture to destroy. What you have is the intangible play. And playwrights tend to be quite concerned about what other directors or performers might do with their play. So, for example, going back to Samuel Beckett, I mentioned earlier, was very precise. I want my play to be performed exactly as it is, to the extent that even today, the estate of Samuel Beckett, obviously he died in 1989, but copyright lasts for 70 years after the life of the author. So that there's another 30 years roughly of copyright left in the Samuel Beckett works. And in that time, the estate has to grant a license to anybody who wants to perform the work. And they will make sure, as a term of the license, that you don't change any of the language. Then even for some plays, there's even more strict provisions. So, for example, famously in the play Waiting for Godot, Beckett said only men may play these roles. And there's been litigation both in France and in Italy over whether women should be allowed to do it. And in France, the French court said the author's rights are clear, the integrity right is paramount. If the author has said women cannot play, then we must not allow this. They prevented the play from being performed with women. In Italy, about 10 years later, around 2006, the court in Rome actually allowed the female production to go ahead on the basis that they had to balance the author's rights with the protection of freedom of expression, and that the actors also had a freedom of expression right. So all of that sort of thing falls into these categories of aura and trajectory in the following way. So really what the concern of the playwright is that the aura of the play, which I define as the expression of meaning of the play, will be damaged. So Samuel Beckett would fear that something in the kind of slightly nihilistic view of the world, the absurdity, when you watch Waiting for Godot, you're not sure, has this happened in some sort of post-apocalyptic kind of end of civilization scenario? It's very hard to work out the location of where it is, but it seems as though as a civilization is kind of very far away from Waiting for Godot. So it's a very forceful and interesting and thought-provoking expression. So clearly Beckett in his head could not imagine female actors conveying that expression. So the aura of the play for him had to remain in place, and the only way of doing that was to have men perform it. Now, I argue in the piece that each work of theatre, and we can go back further than Shakespeare, but for my purposes, I'll start with Shakespeare to go back to UK law. When you go to see Shakespeare today, I don't think anybody really is that concerned about this issue of the aura, because there's so many productions of Shakespeare. It's so much accepted in the trajectory of the play. It's now part of the canon. If you go to a Shakespeare play and you think, oh, they really made a mess of that, they missed the point completely, it was terrible, you don't come out and think, oh, Shakespeare was a terrible writer. And so instead, what you come out and you say, actually, the production just got it wrong, and that can happen. What can you do? So the aura of the play is so strong with something like Hamlet or Macbeth or Othello that it can survive even a very poor production. But obviously, with a new play, the young playwright who's written it or has been a heavy part of the collaboration might have a legitimate concern that the play will not be greeted with a positive critical reception if certain things are not kept in place that the playwright demands. And there have been court cases over this, very few judgments, because they're often resolved because it's kind of a public relations issue after a while. But there have been cases in Australia, in Ireland, and there've also been legal behind the scenes machinations going on in Germany. And I'll speak to the Germany case because it was a particularly interesting one. I think your listeners might like it. So there's a play by a white American playwright called Bruce Norris called Clybourne Park. It's a very good play. I managed to see it last year for the first time. But it's a play about race relations in Chicago. And it's very much about inequalities between the white population, the black population, different perceptions over time, different parts of the city and gentrification, all this kind of thing. So it was a big hit in 2009, 2010 when it first came out in the US, and a German theater then wanted to do the first German production. So it would have been in the German language in Berlin. And to the playwright's surprise, they cast a white German in one of the African-American roles. And they simply were intending to essentially put blackface makeup, put makeup on the performer to make him seem like an African-American. And obviously, in the US context, this is very
it's a no-no.
It's a no-no. It's very discriminatory and it's a taboo. But the German theater at that time, which is only 2012, so it's not even that long ago, they said, "Well, we have always done this in the German theatrical tradition, and it's part of our way of doing it, and we should still be allowed." And the playwright said, "No, listen, this is too disrespectful, and particularly because it's a play about race relations, it would be particularly disrespectful to not cast a German of African descent in the role, or at least it could be a German-speaking American actor, but they have to be black. Otherwise, it would seem quite offensive to do that." And so the playwright withdrew the rights to the play, and so that performance did not go ahead. And so we have this interesting kind of legal right that the playwright has that in different contexts, we might perceive differently. I mean, personally, I would really like to see a female production of Waiting for Godot, because I think it would be really interesting. And I love the play, and I've seen the play played by men, but I personally cannot really imagine why it would be a problem to see women playing the roles.
However, or like for example, look, I'll interrupt you right there. I found out that Patrick Stewart in the late 1990s, early 2000s, did an Othello run where he played Othello, but all the other actors were people of color. So he went around the racism issue that being a Moore character had, swapping all the races.
Yeah. So I mean, theater. One of the fascinating things from a lawyer's point of view is that theater is a space where you can be incredibly imaginative and push boundaries, and freedom of expression in theater is incredibly important. So, I'm more in favor of, let's say, what the Italian court decided in Waiting for Godot. Whereas when you weigh this up, allowing the female production to me makes sense in that context. Definitely something like the Patrick Stewart performance where nobody was in blackface, but they simply flipped the roles again. Obviously, I didn't see that one from 20 years ago, but it sounds really fascinating. And it's the sort of thing that, the theatrical realm offers the opportunity to explore these boundaries. But at the same time, I think we can understand why the playwright in the Clybourne Park context said, actually, no, I don't want a non-black performer to play this role, because actually it could be offensive to anyone in the audience who's black. You'll miss the point of the play, and the aura of the play will be damaged. The German audience will come and they'll think, oh, this is, something could be wrong here. So, it's a sensitive area, and the law obviously does have a role. I mean, one of the actors that I interviewed, and it's mentioned in the book, told me that he's happy to take this on a kind of case-by-case basis. So, for example, he said to me that with Shakespeare, you know, he said it was always edited. They always improvised. It was not a reified work that existed in stone, which is why we have so many different versions of the play that have survived. In the case of Hamlet, for example, even today, people argue about what is the one true text of Hamlet because there's no real answer to that. However, he said that with Beckett, he says he feels he does actually have to serve Beckett because Beckett was so precise. You know, every comma is in place, and so he in his view, he would be respectful of Beckett's wishes in that regard. And I'm sure he would be respectful of Bruce Norris's decision as well in the other context. And so, yeah, I mean, it's one of these fascinating questions that I wanted to delve into with the book. But there's no easy answer to it because, you know, as I said, there are cases where I would prefer the actors to win, and there are other cases like the Clybourne Parkman where I very much understand his objection and why that would be deemed offensive. So I think the case-by-case approach is really the only way to take it. I wouldn't go so far. I mean, in France, they're very pro moral rights, very pro the right of integrity. I wouldn't go so far as that. I wouldn't say that the playwright is always right. I would say sometimes actually you do need to weigh up the other rights that the performers, the actors might have. So, you know, for you as someone who's now based in Italy, it ends up being a pro-Italian approach in my book.
Look, before we move to a different subject, I know that it is always unfair having to choose one. Does Luke McDonagh have a favorite play?
It's a very good question. I think I might pick Waiting for Godot, actually, just, you know, as an Irishman, my fellow Irishman, Samuel Beckett. But I'll add it with a twist, which is that I'm hopeful, you know, I live long enough for it to fall out of copyright. And then we get production. And I'm hoping that one will be the best. And I did see it about 12 years ago, 13 years ago with Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen, and that was superb. So that's in my head. I mean, I don't think I love Shakespeare, but I don't think I could even choose one play. So I think with Samuel, it's a bit easier because Waiting for Godot is his masterpiece. I'm just going to pick that one.
You have also researched and written about artificial intelligence and copyright law. You have published some papers with a friend of ours, Enrico Bonadio, as well. What can you tell us? What's your opinion? I mean, even if you just share a few sentences and a few ideas with us on AI and copyright law.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that the more and more that the technology develops, the more we realize how complicated it is. So when Enrico and I wrote the paper about AI back in 2019, 2020, we looked at two things that are important in the legal debate right now. One is the use of existing works that through the algorithmic processes are kind of fed into the machine learning process. So, for example, you know, you can now in very quick time put in all of the works of, let's say, well, someone did this, Nick Cave, into one of these processes, and then say, write me a song in the style of Nick Cave. So we were looking at, is the use of all of those existing Nick Cave songs, the lyrics, is that an infringement of copyright? And there's actually cases going on now in the UK, in the US and UK about images. Getty Images are taking this case. So we're going to get an answer to that question: is the kind of data mining aspect of AI an infringement? That's one question. So we call that the AI as the consumer of copyright works. But then AI, the output, what it produces, the new song, the parody of the Nick Cave song, can that be protected by copyright as well? And there's different theories here. We again don't have a definitive answer, and it probably to some extent depends on how much instruction has been given by the human. You know, in Europe, we have this idea of intellectual creation. So the more detailed instruction you give, the more you can claim, this is just a tool that I was using to create my song. But then again, the less instruction that you give, the more it seems as though you're not the author. And then it's a question of, should AI be the author? And that's fascinating too. And again, we don't really know the answer to that yet. But there's one aspect that Enrico and I didn't fully envisage when we were working on that paper, but has become incredibly important, which is the voice mimicry issue. So, we had a song that was not AI produced in the sense that a human wrote the song, possibly using some AI tools. But it's a ghostwriter in the music industry who put out this song that was initially claimed to be by Drake and The Weeknd. But the AI aspect that was very clear was using AI to mimic the voices of Drake and The Weeknd. And it was quite effective. I mean, people fell for it. It got thousands and thousands of plays and people liked it. So this would not actually be so much about copyright, but more about what they call in the US the right of publicity, or in the UK, passing off. So in the US back in 1990, Tom Waits won a court case against Doritos when they did an advert with a voice impersonator to make it seem as though it was his voice singing the song, when he hadn't given his permission at all. And actually they'd come to him and he'd said, no, I don't want to be on an ad.
I mean, they should have never approached that. That's the lawyer in us speaking.
Yeah, exactly. So they lost that case. He won that case and he got quite a lot of damages because they said, you've taken his image and his voice and his likeness, and you fraudulently made it seem as though it was him when actually he had no relationship to you. And similarly in the UK, Rihanna won a case 6 or 7 years ago against Topshop when they put her image, her face on a T-shirt without her permission. And so similarly, that was seen as fraudulent passing off because, again, you're linking the image of a celebrity or the voice of a celebrity with your business without permission. So this is going to be a big issue for the next few years, because now you can make your voice sound like an incredibly big star. And we didn't anticipate that would become so important, actually. But this whole issue of deep fakes and AI voice manipulation is really about this other aspect of IP, which is how much can a celebrity or a pop star own their vocal tics, their image, and their identity. And again, we don't know what the answer will be, but we do have these precedents in other respects where it wasn't AI, for example, in the Tom Waits, but it was mimicry. So applying that logic, it's simply another way to mimic the voice. And so it would probably still be a breach of the law in the US to do that, unless you are making clear that it's a parody. So if you make, so for example, in the UK, there is a TV comedy show that ran earlier this year on BBC that was, deep fakes, having deep fake celebrities in funny situations, but it made clear this is unauthorized. These are not the real people, so again, there's no fraud if you tell the truth about what you're doing. But in the case of where you're pretending as though your voice is Rihanna's voice or Tom Waits's, then you've got a legal problem there because you're misleading consumers.
Penultimate question, Luke. I know that you don't have the crystal ball, and I know that you were worried about this when it was actually taking place. What's going to happen with UK law after Brexit, and in particular IP law? And as I said, you cannot predict the future, but I'm sure that you have an educated guess on what might happen, whether they might be divergent, whether they might follow the same path. How are you looking on that?
Yeah, again, great question, Garret. So far, the UK courts have taken a kind of cautious approach. So technically, I mean, since January 2021, the UK courts could have diverged. And the government could have brought in new copyright legislation, new trademark legislation, and so on. So obviously there has been an impact because the UK is outside of the EU trademark system. The Digital Single Market Directive, which applies to copyright, has not come into law in the UK. So there are aspects at which the UK is now outside the system. And so there will be some divergence in the coming years in the copyright field, particularly in that digital realm, because the UK now has stayed out of the newer digital laws that the EU has brought in. But it's interesting to see that the courts haven't grasped this as an opportunity to make really big, deep changes to the law. Instead, they've said, because the UK is a big exporter of copyright products, so music and TV and film. It's an advantage for the UK economy. So stability helps in those industries, and so those industries haven't really been calling for big changes to copyright. So the courts have not, and the government has not made any real changes as yet. But over time, there will inevitably be some divergence. And as I say, the first time in copyright that we'll encounter this is probably to do with, let's say, if you upload content to an intermediary like YouTube or a smaller intermediary. If you do that in the EU now, it's governed by the Digital Single Market Directive, which came into force in 2021. The UK had already left by then, and so the UK didn't bring it into place. So the UK will now be applying a different legal framework to the EU in certain contexts, those digital contexts to do with content. We haven't seen case law yet because these laws always take time to bed in, and then people take cases, and the cases take a long time. But that could be the first area of divergence that we see. But economically speaking, it's important for the creative industries for the law to not be drastically different from the EU, because the EU is still the biggest trading partner. And so having a completely different copyright system would not make sense, because then you would have issues perhaps to do with import, export of products and that sort of thing. So stability and coherence and caution is important, and that's what the courts have taken. But it is inevitable. But it's not going to be the big break that some people predict. And in other fields of the economy, I mean, for example, customs and foodstuffs and medicines, there's much bigger changes that have happened. But in the IP field so far, it's I'd say only had a mild impact.
The last question, Luke, and this one I ask every interviewee because the show is called La Inquietud in Spanish, and I have to pick a translation. So when I do it in English, this is the version. What makes Luke McDONAGH restless?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I could answer it in 1,000 ways, but I'm going to stick with the law for the purposes of today. And I think the thing that makes me restless is the concern that the courts will develop a bad precedent and really negatively affect the creative industries. I would call, for example, in 2015, the blurred lines decision in the US, that sort of bad precedent that caused a lot of uncertainty for musicians. And so I was very relieved, for example, that both the UK courts and the US courts recently, when Ed Sheeran was sued, in both cases, in my view, the courts came to the right decision, which is that neither of these should be infringing activity, because you have to allow people in the creative fields, whether it be theatre, whether it be music, a reasonable degree of copying what came before, because there are only so many plots, there are only so many archetypes in terms of characters. Even single lines of dialogue, sometimes you have to allow a certain amount of reusing. And of course, in music, there's only a small number of notes. In the case of, for example, the US case in Ed Sheeran recently, it was 4 chords that were in dispute. In the UK High Court, it was 4 notes. These were tiny little elements that might have been common to both works, but those have to be the building blocks of creativity. And luckily for Ed Sheeran, he's very wealthy. He was able to hire a good legal team. He testified with his guitar both times, as we mentioned, and the court came to the right conclusion. And so my restlessness abated somewhat from the results of those cases, but it's an ongoing thing for us as lawyers. We have to stay alive to the fact that because our laws affect industries, including the creative industries, we need to be sensitive to the concerns of those industries, particularly musicians, theatre practitioners, because the decisions we make can have a huge impact on their lives, their ability to generate revenue, their ability to create freely. I mean, Ed Sheeran was saying that he would reconsider his musical career if he couldn't use 4 chords. I mean, and a lot of songwriters supported him unquestionably in that. And it's easy to understand why. So I'm restless when the law goes down the wrong path and creates these kinds of problems. But I'm much more satisfied with the law when there's a bit of recognition that actually we need to roll back now and create a bit more certainty in the law so that the creators know what they can and cannot do.
Thank you, Luke, for the time you have shared with us. We send you a big hug.
Thank you, Garret. My pleasure.
Lo teníamos a Luke McDONAGH aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario.
Esto fue La Inquietud con Garret Edwards. Síguenos en redes sociales y en www.edwards.com.ar.